Finally, a YouTube video where I'm actually doing some coaching and not just going about my day telling you that I'm doing some coaching. You can see it for yourself. Gonna run through some of the reviews that I gave to the APX Compete gang not long ago. You might have seen that on my previous YouTube video that I was doing that. Gonna run through some of the cues and some of the errors that I picked up on their Olympic lifts, just so you can see like a step-by-step breakdown of like the coaching process. I always thought that was pretty valuable for me when I was both learning to lift, obviously still learning to lift, never stops, learning to coach as well. I don't really think you see too many types of these video breakdowns on YouTube. Maybe I'm wrong, but without further ado, let's go, let's get stuck into it. So first things first, we're gonna take a look at Ben's clean and jerk. I'm gonna play it through once so we can have a good look at it. I think this is pretty close to Ben's 1 rep max, so we've got to bear that in mind when cueing him on this. Cool, so first things first, taking a look at the clean. I would say there is way too much load in that upper body. We can see that his first movement from the floor is quite a significant pull with the upper body, and then as we pass the knees, it gets exaggerated. I would say, that considered, Ben does a very good job of fully extending, because obviously the temptation is if we pull hard with the upper body to not fully extend and not make the most out of the lower body. He does a very good job considering that. He does jump forward slightly, and I think that is probably as a result of having to make up the difference from not quite having the best leg drive from the floor. So what we do to combat that, first of all, take a look at his start position. His hips are quite high. That is obviously going to make the extension that you have left in your legs limited if you do not start with as much flexion as you could, but to complement that slightly better leg drive. So long story short, slightly lower hips, I'd say. Maybe just bring the chest up and really focus on being controlled and having a solid leg press or a leg drive into the floor. I say leg press because that's a really good analogy I've heard before, is imagining that you're in a actual leg press machine where the angle of your back can't change, especially for that first pull until we get to the knees. So I think that's going to make a big difference for Ben. Slightly lower hip position and picking that chest up ever so slightly. What I also said to Ben was maybe think about bringing the feet slightly closer together, because he is really quite wide in that start position. Obviously start positions are one of those things where it's your own personal discretion as to where you feel like you're most powerful. But I feel like that is going to, provided we keep the toes externally rotated, that's going to further encourage better use of the legs off the floor. It might feel a little bit more comfortable when he does have his hips slightly lower in that start position from there. So taking a look at Ben's split jerk, first things first, well, a pretty good lift in general, but I would say his elbows in his start position are the same as when he's received that clean, which is obviously not the worst thing in the world. We see some really good lifters do exactly that. But a good coaching point and a good habit to get into is sometimes bringing those elbows slightly lower, not only for the reason of a slightly more direct bar path that's going to be encouraged by that, it also really helps to brace the torso. Obviously the biggest danger when you're dipping in the split jerk is that barbell like crashing on you almost and sucking out your tension and ultimately your energy at that bottom position. So anything we can do to really emphasize your brace, I always think is a really good idea. And that for me, when I'm split jerking, acts as like a bit of an extra cue to remember to really stay tight, is to just get that elbow or get those elbows into that position, start my brace, obviously encourage that straight bar path, and then we go from there. But all in all, Ben's dip and drive is really good. His elbows do come down a little bit as he does dip, but doesn't affect the quality of the lift. Moves under it nicely, and one thing that's really good is that he does have a bend in his back leg, and that allows him the ability to adjust slightly, because obviously it wasn't the cleanest of received positions, but because he did have that bend in his back leg, he's able just to shift his body weight backwards a little bit by the look of his foot, because his heel is kind of approaching the floor in that position. But that gives him the ability to adjust and receive that weight nicely, and ultimately get a clean lift at a pretty high percentage, so that's good. We are on to Emma's clean complex. This complex was a clean pull, a hang squat clean, a front squat, and a split jerk. Just going to take a look at the clean pull and the hang squat clean. So there we can see us played through. first thing we probably notice is that bend of the arms. But first thing I'm actually going to pick up on is use of the legs. Obviously those two cues are intertwined, but really want to focus on, in the clean pull, how she passes the knees and obviously is performing that second pull ready to fully extend, but then she stays on flat feet. The height that she gets out of the bar purely comes from the upper body, so that's something that we'd need to address. With clean pulls, I often like to coach people to not even get the upper body involved too much at all until you're at a point where you know, you understand the timing of things. I feel like the high pull, I've said about this before on my social media and Instagram and stuff, that the high pull for both the clean and the snatch is pretty useless for a lot of people, because their ability to use the legs is already something that takes a long time for people to get. When we're looking at CrossFit, first 2-3 years, most people will tell you that they have dealt with an early arm bend and performing a movement which encourages the maximum pull of the upper body that you can. Obviously it's supposed to be at the right time, but for a lot of people they get it so wrong. So I would, for beginner intermediates, never program high pulls unless, you know, there's very good reason to do so. Going off on a tangent a little bit there, it will just be a case of getting used to, for Emma, really loading the legs, especially from the knee onwards, because we can see from the floor it is not really too much of an issue, her using her legs. She moves past the knee quite well, but she then moves on to obviously pulling quite hard into what is very, very close to the hip crease, which is not really our point where we want to be contacting the bar when it comes to the clean in any variation. From there, we move into the hang squat clean, and very similar thing, as you'd imagine. Nice to know that she's consistent at least. She moves from that start position and the arms do the first movement essentially. We want to load from, or lead with the chest, sorry, and that combined with driving the legs into the floor should be what initiates the movement, as opposed to pulling with the upper body. One thing that I always find really, really valuable, and I absolutely swear by, when I'm teaching people that are coming from, to be honest, from any background, but I always, if I am teaching people from scratch, I use this method too, is teaching people the ollie lift from the top down, and that way you really drill in some important positions. And this is something that Emma has potentially missed as well with her hang squat clean. I'll just watch it back, yeah. So moving to her start position, you'll see that she's just hinged straight over. She's pushed her hips straight back and moved to that start position. For a lot of people, this might not be a problem, but I always teach people to drop to what's known as the power position first, or the down position, depending on the weightlifting model that you're using. And that's essentially keeping a really upright torso before you then hinge back, because when you do then come to extend, you just reverse the process and your legs are already in the best position to be utilized for that lift. So just a case of, before going into that hang position, like I said, dropping the body height, then sending the hips to the back of the room. And I think that's relevant for, honestly, for all levels. I really think that's a valuable point, which takes next to no effort to add into your process when you're performing that lift, but potentially can have massive payoff for using your legs, but also creating a good amount of consistency with every single lift that you're doing. So points that I got across to Emma were legs from the floor, but also legs as you pass the knee, and making sure that we're really not focusing on the upper body getting involved too soon. And then obviously making sure that to initiate from that start position, we're driving the legs into the floor and leading with the chest, arms stay completely straight, and utilizing that power position in our setup if we can. About time we had a snatch in there. Back with Ben for this one. Let's just play it through so you can see the whole thing. Cool. Pretty obvious from the floor what's going on. But there's one thing that's probably not quite so obvious. So first things first, early arm bend. We can see that Ben's nearly at a 90-degree angle with forearm and upper arm there. And so that could obviously be corrected. We want to think about keeping those arms completely straight. I always think, to be honest, like Ben has got his knuckles to the floor here, but for people that are getting used to maybe a slightly different position, that do have an early arm bend, they need to keep the bar close to them without bending the arms. I always think that is a good cue. Keeping the knuckles pointing towards the floor helps keep the lats on, but the arms pretty relaxed. What I would say is Ben would potentially need to look at taking a slightly wider grip on the bar. I think he's a tall guy, so that might help him to feel that little bit more comfortable with that bar coming into the hip crease. I would definitely say some tempo snatches at some very light weights, and to be honest, they don't even need to be snatches at this stage. We could get some snatch pulls in there to make sure that that barbell comes all the way into the hip crease naturally with completely straight arms, because ultimately that's what I think people fear with that early arm bend. It is the barbell is never going to come into the hip crease, so it's never going to make that natural contact with the body, so they have to row it, they have to pull it directly in. If we also look at this path of the bar off the floor as well, we can notice that it does come out and around the knees slightly, and if we are like, potentially the early arm bend is playing into that, but if we ignore that for a second, I would also say normally that comes from people setting with their hips a little bit too low. This would be pretty marginal for Ben because his hips aren't ridiculously low in his start position, but it could well be a factor. As you can imagine, the lower your hips are, the further forward your knees are pushed, therefore the bar has to go around them, or your knees have to go back and out of the way significantly more to maintain a straight bar path. But obviously what happens a lot of the time is your knees don't move out of the way, and the bar does move out of the way, making for an inefficient bar path, which is obviously not what we're looking for. So a lot of the time, especially, this might sound a bit stupid, but especially Europeans, Caucasians, people that are not Asians basically, are not built in such a way where we can start with a stupidly low hip position. Obviously different genetics make for different things, everyone's different, but in general I do see it a lot where you've got people that are not built to be snatching like Asians, trying to replicate their technique and suffering as a result of it. So very often start position for the hips does not need to be super low, because all it's doing at the end of the day is making it harder for you to maintain a straight bar path, when a slightly higher hip position for some people can actually be the money maker. It certainly was for me when I realized that helped my bar path massively. So yeah, just thinking about maybe a slightly higher hip position, but obviously in general here, Ben's going pretty fast from the floor. Maybe if he got that early arm bend sorted and went a little bit slower from the floor, his ability to concentrate and move those hips or move those knees backwards out of the way and then back under the bar would be a lot better. Therefore, maybe he wouldn't need to fix that hip position in the start. But worth noting on that one, because that is a very common error that, you know, if people are pulling out and around their knees, it can very often be the case. But yeah, if I was coaching Ben on a one-to-one basis, I'd definitely start with arms and being controlled from the floor, and then we could look at hips from there. Into our final review. This is Jake, and this is his split jerk. This was his fail, and I'll take a look at his make successful lift, whatever you want to call it, as well. So what I said to Jake was, especially in his fail, he's coming forwards quite significantly in his dip and drive, and then to compensate for that, he has really slamming his body weight forwards to try and receive that barbell overhead. We can see why Jake is a big, strong guy, so he does probably have the ability to receive that, like a decent weight overhead. But as weights continue to increase, that technique error is going to be exaggerated, as we can see in that fail. Obviously, was to make sure that when he's dipping and driving, that his body weight is centered. He is not coming forwards in that dip and drive. That's definitely the first place to look. This is an interesting one because for a lot of people, we have to consciously think about getting the head and torso through to be in a nice tight position with that barbell overhead, but that is not the same for everyone. If someone else, you know, has that natural bias of overly coming forwards, sometimes we actually need to focus on being a bit more centered, and that's exactly what I said to him. So he needs to focus on keeping his center of mass slightly more centered when he does receive that barbell, but obviously still getting his front foot out and his back foot into position as well. That I suggested to him would be a good thing to practice with tool jerks in his primer, to really focus on punching underneath the bar or pressing underneath the bar to get to that receive position without everything coming forwards. And obviously that, coupled with staying a bit more centered in his dip and drive, is hopefully going to mean that bar path is a little bit more direct to that centered overhead position where he's going to receive it, and obviously his torso and his receive position is going to be centered underneath the bar. One more thing to note with Jake's split jerk, as I mentioned with Ben, his elbows are very high, reflective of probably what he would be doing if he had to do a front squat or stand up a clean. What we can think about again is thinking about dropping those elbows slightly. This is going to be pretty valuable for him, especially as that barbell is coming forwards a lot. We can think about dropping those elbows to focus on not only that nice straight bar path, but also that nice aggressive, I say aggressive, I mean that nice effective brace of the torso and upper body in general to emphasize that straight dip and drive. That is it, guys. Hopefully you got your fix. Do remember that if you would like to get in touch with me for one-to-one bespoke coaching, semi-bespoke coaching, or you want to get on board with our community that is APX Compete, then you will see the relevant links below. Don't hesitate to reach out with any questions in between times either. Please drop us a like and subscribe, it all helps, and I will see you in the next one.